Chapter 17, Video 1. The good news is this is our last chapter. The bad news is there are 4 videos for this chapter because it's the Civil War and there's a lot to cover. Let's start off with where we left off, right? That the southern states had seceded in December, January, and February of 1860 to 1861. Lincoln does not accept this secession, and he is determined to unite the country, keep it all as one country. Now, there was a U.S. federal fort in Charleston, South Carolina, called Fort Sumter, that Lincoln did not want to give up, and so he is going to tell the South that he's going to resupply that fort with non-military materials. We did not feel like we could let that happen. The Southerners did not feel like that could be allowed to happen. And the Southern forces ordered the leader of Fort Sumter, Major Robert Anderson, to surrender the fort. He refused to do so, and the Southern forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, and Anderson then surrendered the fort. Well, the Southerners had shot the first shots of the war. And so Lincoln is going to declare war and call up 75,000 troops for a 90-day enlistment, which is a clear indication he had no real understanding of what all lay ahead. When Lincoln declared war against the South, several other southern states seceded. West Virginia is not going to have very many slaveholders in it, and they did not want to participate in this, and so the western part of the state of Virginia will pull out and join the North as the state of West Virginia. There were some states right along the border that were kind of teetering, and they were Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, and it became very important to Lincoln to hold on to those states. Where we had some factories that tended to be in those states, and so Lincoln is trying to hold on to those border states of Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. And so he is going to implement some limits on civil rights in that area. For example, he suspended writs of habeas corpus. A writ of habeas corpus is the court order that gets you out of the jail cell to have your appearance in court. And so there were people who waited an extremely long period of time before they ever had an appearance in court. He also would jail people who were supporting the Confederacy in those states. Now, Robert E. Lee in the South was offered a position in the Northern Army by Lincoln, but Lee couldn't bring himself to shoot at fellow Virginians, and so he is going to refuse Lincoln's offer and take command of the Army of Northern Virginia. Now, you have a slide in your PowerPoints that's called North and South Advantages, and you can look at that one slide and kind of see how the war is going to go. Certainly the North had the advantage in size, in numbers, in materials, in industry, and so forth. They had more of everything than the South had, even down to boots and the ability to make more boots and so forth. They had more of everything. The first battle that will take place is the Battle of Bull Run. The North will be led by McDowell. The South will be led by Beauregard. Both sides thought this would be kind of an easy battle. In fact, there were local people who came and brought their picnics and so forth to watch the battle. They thought it was going to be kind of neat and exciting. They were trampled as the armies retreated later in the day. This was a bit of a rush battle where Lincoln wanted to use his forces before the 90-day enlistment was up. So this is that Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas Junction. In this battle, the South will win. We also see Thomas Jackson stand like a stone wall and get the nickname of Stonewall Jackson, and we'll see the promise of his military abilities being realized and so forth. But the biggest lesson we get out of this first Battle of Bull Run is the understanding on both sides that this was going to be a very long war. Now, the strategy for both sides will play a significant role, particularly for the North. They had something called the Anaconda strategy. The Anaconda strategy was to blockade the southeastern coast, right, to blockade all the way around the Confederate States of America, to come up the Mississippi River and then move inward, and to come down from the north, and then essentially squeeze with the blockade, and then coming down from the north and over from the Mississippi River, and then squeeze. That's their plan, that's what they do, and that's how they win. The South had the strategy of just holding out. We hoped for some help from a foreign country, but as much as anything, we could fight a defensive war. The North had the harder task of bringing us back in. We just needed to hold out long enough for the North to get tired of it all. When it comes to the Navy, the North had, of course, a better Navy than the South had. We had one ironclad that was called the Merrimac. We tried to change the name to the Virginia, but it still gets remembered as the Merrimac more often. The North had an ironclad called the Monitor, and there was a famous battle between the Merrimac and the Monitor on the Chesapeake Bay. By some accounts, the South had won that battle, but what's going to end up happening is within a short period of time, the South was about to lose that ship to the North, and so we're going to destroy it to keep the North from getting it. In 1862, Admiral David Farragut with the Northern Navy will force his way into the Mississippi River and take New Orleans, and that will be the first step of that Mississippi River part of the Anaconda Plan. As for the two armies, Lincoln had started off with 75,000, but he's going to get Congress to allow 500,000 more troops to be added after the first Battle of Bull Run. These troops were organized along ethnic lines. Black troops were separate from white troops. In 1863, they did start to have a draft, and the ages for the draft were 20 to 45. You could avoid the draft by paying $300. The North needed some money for the war as well, and they had more citizens to draw from, so you could pay $300 and get out of the draft. In the South, Jefferson Davis had 100,000 troops for a 12-month enlistment, and he will ultimately be given about 400,000 troops for 3 years. And the South will look to the draft or conscription as well. In 1862, the Southern draft said all white male citizens aged 18 to 35 had to join. You could then it's going to be 35 at first, and then it's going to get expanded to the age of 45 and then brought down until really by 1864 it was age 17 to 50. You could get out of the draft in the South if you hired a substitute to take your place, or if you paid $500 to get out of it. Now, the South, as I said, was hoping for foreign help. We really aren't going to get the kind of foreign help that we had hoped. No other country ever recognized our independence, and very few gave us any supplies. One exception to this, sort of an exception to this, is in England, the South could build a ship in England or have a ship built in England, but they wouldn't arm it. They wouldn't put weapons on that ship in England. And so the ship would be sailed out into international waters and armed at sea. And that was how Britain would try to sell the South some ships while trying to avoid picking sides in this war. Now, when the war is over, one of those ships was called the Alabama. And when the war was over, the North sued Great Britain over the damages done by the Alabama. And the North will win that suit.